There is a very strange decision being made at NASA right now. In less than 2 weeks, 4 astronauts are scheduled to board a spacecraft and fly farther from Earth than any human has traveled in over 50 years. They will loop around the moon. They will venture into the deepest reaches of space that humanity has touched since 1972. And they will do it inside a capsule with a known flaw. A flaw that NASA has decided to fly anyway. This is the story of Artemis II, and the heat shield nobody wants to talk about. In November 2022, NASA launched Artemis I, an uncrewed test flight. Orion traveled to the moon, looped around it, and came screaming back toward Earth at over 25,000 miles per hour. Re-entry was violent. The spacecraft's heat shield, covered in a material called avcoat, was supposed to ablate, to char and erode in a controlled manner, flaking off in microscopic particles, carrying heat away from the capsule. That's not what happened. When engineers inspected the heat shield after splashdown, they found something unexpected. Chunks of the material had broken off. NASA identified more than 100 locations where ablative thermal protective material wore away differently than predicted. The heat shield had cracked, and then it had spalled. Large fragments breaking free during the most critical phase of flight. This was not supposed to happen. NASA disclosed the problem months after Orion returned from space in 2022. The agency's Office of Inspector General released images in 2024. What they showed was unsettling: cavities, charred material missing from the surface. The heat shield looked like it had been through a battle, and in a way, it had. Now, you would think NASA would replace the heat shield before putting astronauts on board. They didn't, because by the time Artemis I landed, the heat shield for Artemis II was already installed, and you couldn't just go, as one astronaut put it, to some heat shield removal shop and swap it out. The capsule was sealed, the hardware was integrated, so NASA made a choice. They would fly it anyway. At that point, NASA faced only 2 options: replace the heat shield or change the flight path. Replacing the heat shield would take over a year. The Artemis II Orion capsule already had its heat shield bonded in place. Removing it would require dismantling much of the spacecraft. The timeline would slip, the mission would be delayed again. NASA chose the second option. They would modify Orion's re-entry trajectory. Instead of a high skip, they would perform what flight controllers call a loft, a shallower, steeper descent. The goal was to reduce exposure time at peak heating. To minimize the conditions that caused the cracking on Artemis I, the modified trajectory would create a steeper descent angle. Less time in the hot zone, less opportunity for gases to build up. NASA ran simulations. They ran more arc jet tests. They validated the approach. And they concluded that the modified trajectory would keep the crew safe. But not everyone was convinced. Dr. Charlie Kamada, a heat shield expert and former NASA astronaut who flew on the first space shuttle mission after the Columbia disaster, was among those who spoke out. He said the agency was kicking the can down the road instead of solving the problem. Dr. Dan Rasky, who worked at NASA for over 30 years, put it bluntly, "You're right at the point of incipient failure. It's like you're at the edge of the cliff on a foggy day." But others defended the decision. Dr. Danny Olivas, a former astronaut who served on NASA's independent review team, said the agency has its arms around the problem. He acknowledged the heat shield is deviant, not what NASA would want to give its astronauts. But he believed NASA understood the risks. And here's the critical point. NASA's own data showed that even if crew had been aboard Artemis I, they would have been safe. The temperature inside the cabin remained in the mid-70s Fahrenheit. Well within limits, the thermal performance of the heat shield exceeded expectations, even with the cracking. So the question isn't really whether the heat shield will crack. Everyone agrees it will. The question is whether it will crack too much. This is where Artemis II becomes fundamentally different, because it's not just that it's non-permeable, it's that it's less permeable than the one that flew on Artemis I. During Artemis I, about 6% of the heat shield's surface area was permeable, and those permeable areas did not suffer any cracking. The material vented properly. The gases escaped, no problem. But the Artemis II heat shield doesn't have any permeable areas. Zero. That change was made before Artemis I flew, before NASA realized permeability was critical to performance. So NASA is flying a heat shield that, by their own analysis, is more prone to cracking than the one that already cracked. The justification is this: the modified trajectory will compensate. The shallower re-entry will reduce the thermal load. The heat shield won't experience the same conditions that caused the Artemis I damage. But there's a problem with that logic. You're solving a material problem with an operational workaround. And if something goes wrong during re-entry, if the trajectory deviates even slightly, you're back to square one. Some critics, like Kamada, argue that NASA should be using more sophisticated computer modeling, multi-physics analysis that can predict not just when the heat shield will crack, but how those cracks will grow, how the material will behave under stress. NASA used a tool called the Crack Indication Tool. It models gas generation, material charring, and predicts when cracks happen. But Kamada says it can't predict crack growth. It can't tell you whether a small crack will stay small or become catastrophic. NASA counters that the tool successfully predicted the Artemis I cracking, that it's been validated with real-world data. Dr. Steve Scotty, a distinguished research associate at NASA's Langley Research Center, offered a more nuanced view. He said Orion has built-in robustness. Underneath the avcoat layer is a composite structure. It's not designed to be a backup heat shield, but during testing, it was able to briefly survive extreme re-entry temperatures. It's a last line of defense, one that NASA hopes they'll never need. After extensive analysis and testing, NASA determined the cause. The problem wasn't the material itself, it was permeability. Avcoat is an ablative material. It's designed to char under extreme heat. When Orion dips into the atmosphere, the material heats up. Chemical reactions occur. Gases are produced. These gases are supposed to vent through the material, to dissipate harmlessly, but during Artemis I, the avcoat wasn't permeable enough. The gases couldn't escape. Pressure built up inside the heat shield, and when the pressure became too great, the material cracked. Then it broke off. NASA conducted over 120 tests to understand this phenomenon. They used arc jet facilities, wind tunnels. They subjected avcoat samples to heating profiles that matched the Artemis I re-entry, and they were able to replicate the cracking behavior. Here's where it gets interesting. During the Artemis I mission, Orion used something called a skip guidance entry technique. Think of it like a stone skipping across water. The spacecraft dips into the upper atmosphere, uses atmospheric drag to slow down. Then it skips back out. Then it re-enters for final descent. During the period between dips, heating rates decreased, but thermal energy accumulated inside the heat shield. The avcoat didn't have time to form a permeable char layer, so the gases built up, and the cracking occurred. NASA had tested this extensively on the ground before Artemis I's, but they tested at much higher heating rates than the spacecraft actually experienced in flight. Those high heating rates allowed the char to form and ablate as expected. The gas pressure was released. But the actual Artemis I re-entry was less severe. The heating was slower, the process of char formation slowed down, but the gases were still being created, and they had nowhere to go. It's a bit like boiling water in a sealed pot. Eventually, something has to give. And even if the heat shield performs exactly as NASA expects, Artemis II is still carrying another risk. The radiation factor, a second risk. A radiation protection system, essentially a pillow fort made of supplies. They'll tie bundles of equipment to the least shielded walls, create makeshift shielding, and then they'll wait it out. It's not ideal, but it's the reality of deep space exploration. The mannequin data also revealed something unexpected. When Orion flipped during its passage through the Van Allen belts, radiation levels inside the capsule dropped by 50%. Just by changing the spacecraft's orientation, NASA is incorporating that into Artemis II planning. They're looking for ways to optimize the vehicle's orientation during radiation events, to put more shielding in the path of incoming particles. But they can't predict when a solar storm will occur. They can only prepare and hope. Some of the criticism directed at NASA isn't just about the heat shield, it's about culture, about decision-making, about whether the agency is learning from its past. Charlie Kamada, who lived through the Columbia disaster, sees troubling parallels. He says NASA has shifted away from the research mindset that defined the Apollo era. Engineers back then were encouraged to identify problems, to challenge assumptions, to dig into the fundamentals. Today, he worries, engineers are encouraged to fall in line, to accept the assessments of management, to prioritize schedule over safety. Edgar Zapata, a retired Kennedy Space Center engineer, agrees. He says NASA's decision-making can feel like mysterious forces at work. Once the agency decides to move forward, it figures out a way to make it happen, whether it should or not. NASA estimated during the Space Shuttle era that the vehicle had a 1 in 100,000 chance of catastrophic failure. The actual rate was 1 in 67, 2 explosions in 135 missions. Kamada isn't predicting Artemis II will fail. He thinks it's likely the mission will return safely. What he fears is that a safe flight will validate NASA's decision-making process, that it will lull the agency into a false sense of security. Dr. Danny Olivas agrees on this point. Sometimes we get lucky, he said. And when we get lucky, sometimes we trade that for being good, and then we convince ourselves we're better than we really are. It's a sobering thought. NASA Administrator Jared Isaacman addressed these concerns head-on. In January 2025, shortly after being sworn in, he convened a meeting at NASA headquarters. He invited critics like Kamada and Olivas. He brought in the engineering teams. He opened up the data. The meeting lasted over 3 hours. Isaacman said he wanted to hear dissenting opinions, to understand the risks, to make sure NASA wasn't missing something. After the meeting, Olivas changed his mind. He had been reluctant to fly on Artemis II, but the Tiger team's analysis convinced him. He now says he would fly on Orion. Kamada remained skeptical, but he thanked the leadership for bringing him in, for allowing him to voice his concerns. Isaacman also brought in 2 reporters. He allowed them to observe, to report on the discussions, for the sake of transparency. It was, by all accounts, an unusual move for NASA, and a necessary one. Here's where NASA's engineering gets interesting, because they didn't just assume the heat shield would work. They asked a different question. What if we're wrong? What if large sections of the heat shield fail completely during re-entry? What if chunks of avcoat the size of dinner plates are stripped away? What happens then? NASA conducted damage tolerance evaluations. They subjected the composite base of the Orion spacecraft to high energies. They tested it for 10 seconds. For 10 minutes, longer than the period of heating Artemis II will experience. What they found was critical. Even in the event of catastrophic heat shield failure, the structure of Orion would remain solid. The crew would be safe inside. The vehicle could still land in a watertight manner. The composite layer beneath the heat shield is designed to withstand a maximum temperature of 500 degrees Fahrenheit. During Artemis I, even with the cracking and char loss, the maximum temperature recorded was 160 degrees. That's a substantial margin. It means Orion has built-in robustness, multiple layers of protection. It's not relying solely on the avcoat material. This is what gave Olivas confidence. NASA wasn't just hoping the heat shield would work. They were preparing for what happens if it doesn't. And that's a very different calculation. Reid Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, Jeremy Hansen, 4 names that will soon be written into history. They've spent months training, geology training in Iceland, systems training at Kennedy Space Center, simulations, procedures, preparing for every contingency. In September 2023, they stood inside the white room on the crew access arm of the mobile launcher. They inspected the hardware, They looked into the Orion capsule that would be their home. Wiseman, the mission commander, has been following every aspect of the heat shield decision. He's reviewed the data, he's talked to the engineers, and he's expressed confidence. The investigators discovered the root cause, he said in July 2024. If we stick to the new re-entry path that NASA has planned, then this heat shield will be safe to fly. Glover, the pilot, will become the first African-American astronaut to leave low Earth orbit. Koch has already set records aboard the International Space Station. Hansen will be the first Canadian astronaut to venture beyond low Earth orbit. They know the risks. They've been briefed on the heat shield. They've participated in the decision-making process. And they've chosen to fly. That's not blind faith. That's informed consent. So here we are. NASA is about to send 4 astronauts to the moon on a spacecraft with a known flaw. A heat shield that cracked during its test flight. A heat shield that is less permeable than the one that failed. A heat shield that NASA has decided to fly anyway. Is it reckless? Or is it calculated risk? The truth is somewhere in between. Space exploration has always been dangerous. We've known this since the beginning. Since Gus Grissom and Ed White and Roger Chaffee died in a fire on the launch pad. Since the Challenger exploded 73 seconds after liftoff. Since Columbia disintegrated during re-entry. We've learned from those tragedies. We've built better systems. We've developed better procedures. We've gotten better at predicting failure. But we can't eliminate risk entirely. Not if we want to go back to the moon. Not if we want to go to Mars. The question isn't whether the Artemis II heat shield will crack. It will. The question is whether NASA has enough margin, enough robustness, enough backup systems to bring the crew home safely. And the answer, according to NASA's data, is yes. But data is not certainty. Models are not reality. And until that capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, we won't know for sure. Dr. Steve Scotty put it best. We still have things we don't know. It's not low risk, it's moderate risk. Moderate risk. That's the threshold we're operating at. It's higher than anyone would like. But it's what we have, and sometimes that has to be enough. Because the alternative is to stop, to wait, to delay indefinitely until we have perfect knowledge. And perfect knowledge doesn't exist. So NASA will fly. The crew will board the Orion capsule. The SLS will ignite. And 4 astronauts will venture farther from Earth than anyone has traveled in over 50 years. They'll fly on a spacecraft with a heat shield that isn't perfect, but it might just be good enough. And maybe that's the real story of exploration. Not perfection, but calculated risk. Not certainty, but courage. For now, all we can do is watch and wait and hope that when Orion comes screaming back through the atmosphere at 25,000 miles per hour, that heat shield holds. Because the margin between triumph and tragedy is thinner than we'd like to admit. And that's what makes it worth doing.